I'm excited to be invited back to talk to the Center for Healthy Sex audience. I think it was about 5 years ago that I came and spoke, and I'm going to give a real similar presentation, but updated. There's been some new research that has come out, and I'm sure that a lot of the audience is new to my story and background, and also just new to the porn debate and the science behind addiction and sexual conditioning that we will be digging into. I have a lot of slides to get through today. I probably should have trimmed some more out than I did. So if you are screenshot happy, please feel free to screenshot any slides if I move a little quickly. First off, I just want to start out by kind of giving the context of what I'm talking about. This presentation is not going to be necessarily about sex addiction. I personally like to differentiate the two, mainly just because some people's stories can be very differently, and the advice and information that applies to their individual situation can be very different between a hypersexual or a sex addict that is maybe hooking up with people in an alley or something like that, compared to a porn addict who may be a virgin who has only known connection with a screen. And he may not even be able, as you'll hear later, to have sex. He might not even be able to if he has a porn-induced sexual dysfunction. So just for semantic purposes, just to give y'all context, I'm going to stay away from that. I'm also not talking about masturbation. I'm talking about porn use and its impact on you. So not talking about, masturbation without porn. And I'm not talking about a specific group of people. I'm a heterosexual male, but this presentation will apply to everyone, regardless of your background or whether you are a person of faith or not. And it's not about the porn industry. I'm not on a mission to, fight the porn industry. I don't consider myself anti-porn. I consider myself pro-education and pro-healthy sex. And it's not about morality or moral opinions or anything like that. Again, my story and everything I cover will apply to you regardless of what you believe. I just like to stick to the neuroscience and my own personal story and insight. So with that, let's begin. This is a serious problem. Porn's impact that it's having on our culture and this especially young generation. And I wanted to start just talking about this right here. So on the left is a screenshot from a TikTok video I posted a few weeks ago that went viral. And it just is, the caption says, how it feels being exposed to porn at a young age and ending up dependent on it for sexual pleasure. And I just wanted to show y'all that I got bombarded with hundreds and hundreds of comments by people, a lot of them young, teenagers, saying that they were 6, me, but age 5, and I was 5, and I was even someone that's been in this for like a decade. It was kind of another slap in the face of how big of an issue this was. And some of y'all might be familiar with Billie Eilish, the Grammy award-winning singer, coming out at the end of last year on the Howard Stern podcast. And she talked about how she was exposed to porn at 11. And in her words, it destroyed her brain. I like to use the phrase rewired or changed because I don't think it's destroyed. But her point was definitely valid, and it really had a negative impact on her. And she's actually her age of exposure is the average age of exposure, which is 11. And this isn't necessarily a new problem now, because this has been going on for, a decade or more. This book, a New York Times bestselling book, The Brain That Changes Itself by psychiatrist Norman Doidge, in chapter 4, he dedicated an entire chapter on porn addiction and the whole neuroplasticity behind sexual conditioning. And I want to read this quote. He said, "During the mid to late 1990s, when the internet was growing rapidly and pornography was exploding on it, I treated or assessed a number of men who all had essentially the same story. They reported increasing difficulty of being turned on by their actual sexual partners, spouses, or girlfriends, though they still considered them objectively attractive." Now, I know what Norman Doidge was describing is legit because it happened with me. And I'll just share with y'all briefly a little bit about my story. So I grew up as a part of this first generation. I'm 34 years old now, but my family got high-speed internet access around the age of 11 and 12. And so I was first exposed to porn the good old-fashioned way, magazines, when I was 8 years old. At age 10, I started watching softcore porn, HBO, late night Skinamax, shows like that, and also MTV and BET booty shaking videos. But things got really bad when I was 12. And that's, like I mentioned, when I had easy access to internet porn. My friends at the middle school I went to would share tips on how we could watch it, for free. And back then it was before tube sites, which mimic YouTube, and it was file sharing sites like LimeWire and Kazaa. And, you could have like 10 videos downloading at the same time. So it was kind of a glimpse into the future of what was about to happen with the novelty that tube sites provide. And I also became sexually active at the age of 14. So all through my adolescence, I was watching porn and sexually active. And I like to say a battle began then between my libido or my drive, between pixels on a screen and real life partners. And through high school and into college, I don't know if y'all have seen that animation called Nuggets, where the little bird is sipping the golden nugget. And as he sips more and more nuggets, it's a great animation about addiction and being desensitized. The world around him got darker and darker. And he, got to the point where that little nugget was the only thing that gave him pleasure. And this happened to me without me even realizing it. And unfortunately, I got to the point where I was 23 years old, otherwise healthy, no other problems that I was aware of. But when I went to have sex with a beautiful girl I was attracted to, my body could not respond. And no matter what we tried to do, and regardless of the fact that I found her extremely attractive, I could not get an erection. And so I went searching for answers, as anyone would. And it took me a while. All I could find at first was, if you're young and healthy, you have performance anxiety. And I knew that wasn't the case because I had sexual experience, and I knew I wasn't, nervous enough to not feel anything at all, to feel completely disconnected, until I stumbled on forums with tens of thousands, now hundreds of thousands of people all over the internet who all had essentially the same story. They had used internet porn for several years and eventually got to a place where they were dependent on porn for sexual arousal and to be able to get and maintain an erection. And it was good knowing that I was not alone, but I just began soaking up all the information on the topic. I wanted to learn how this could happen. And that's when I started reading up on the neuroscience and following the mainstream debate and how this was covered in mainstream media. And I noticed that there was tons of misconceptions on the topic. And I want to get into a couple of those. And the first misconception is this new generation that grew up with, they call it the AAA, unlimited access, easy access, affordability, it's free, and anonymity, the AAA. We grew up with this, and that's leading to a bunch of young people developing problems that didn't necessarily have issues driving them to consume. If you think of an adolescent brain, which I'll talk about a little bit more later, you are naturally curious about sex. You're naturally, have a drive to seek out potential mates and partners as you go through puberty and you become an adolescent. And so, you find it arousing, your brain is not fully developed, you're kind of, at the peak of dopamine production and seeking and searching for exciting experiences. And then you combine that with the fact that we didn't have any education on potential negative effects. I like to say, I stayed away from cocaine in high school because I knew of the negative effects, but I had no idea that porn could have a potential negative effect on me. And so it really is a recipe for lots of young people like Billie Eilish and myself and countless other people to develop problems. And some therapists have started to point this out that, a classic addict and an opportunity addict, they're kind of differentiating those two. Therapist Rob Weiss said this. I want to read this to y'all because I think he really captures it nice and concise. He said, for a long time, therapists treated sex and porn addiction, found that all, or at least the vast majority of their clients had deep and powerful underlying early life trauma issues, neglect, physical abuse, sexual abuse, covert incest, etc. This put sex and porn addicts very much in line with alcoholics, drug addicts, compulsive gamblers, and the like. In fact, there's a large body of research showing unresolved early life trauma to be a huge risk factor for later life addiction of all types. Recently, however, sexual disorders therapists like myself have encountered a new and rapidly growing subcategory of sex and porn addicts. These are individuals who readily meet the criteria for sex and porn addiction, but lack the underlying early life trauma that typically drives an addiction. Now, I want to pause right here and say that I'm not saying a blanket statement either way, right? Lots of people that struggle with compulsive behaviors and addictions do have underlying issues that need to be addressed in therapy or in a professional setting. But my main point in even bringing this up is the whole debate about causation. People dismiss that porn's causing problems because they always want to say, oh, well, porn's never the issue. There's always underlying trauma or abuse for it to develop into a problem. My point is, if you have a young child's brain that gets involved with either a substance or an addictive behavior like watching internet pornography, that can develop into a problem in and of itself. It can be a primary cause of a disorder. So that's my point there. Another misconception is the attractiveness misconception. And this is for partners out there or anyone who has a loved one or a partner that has an addiction or a dysfunction. I like to say that you're not the problem. The problem's not with your physical appearance or your body. The problem is in their brain with physiological changes. It's not about the looks necessarily of the actors and actresses in the videos. Porn addiction, once you develop into a genuine addiction, it becomes more about shock, surprise, maybe a certain fetish or something like that to get a bigger neurochemical hit. And while it's true, yes, you might start out looking for attractive porn stars or whatever the case may be. I just want to point out that once a problem develops, it's usually nothing to do with looks and everything to do with seeking a bigger hit. The next thing I want to talk about is what I call Rule 34. And again, this is for people that say porn can't cause problems. It's only if you're watching, maybe violent or abusive or misogynistic content. If you stay consuming, what quote unquote ethical porn, then no problem will ever develop. And there's actually a push for young people to learn porn literacy, where basically, if you really dumb it down to its most basic point, is if you can teach kids to be critical consumers of porn, they'll never develop problems. And the big issue there is it's not about content, it's about brain changes. And regardless if you're watching, any genre of porn, even cartoon porn, like right here, I have Homer and Marge Simpson about to go at it. Anything can rewire the brain to need novelty and pixels on a screen for arousal and can cause the other addiction-related brain changes. Another one is high libido. I'll get into this more later, but this kind of goes back to my point about this not being about sex addiction or hypersexuality, which historically has been the main focus, especially when talking about getting this into the DSM. I'm sorry, my throat's a little dry. So where was I? So high libido, that's one of the biggest pushbacks on getting, porn addiction or sex addiction in the diagnostic manuals, which I'll get into the debate more later. But over 25 studies refute that addiction isn't necessarily just high libido, and we're not trying to pathologize normal sexual behavior. This one study on high school seniors found that 16% of those who watched porn more than once a week had abnormally low sexual desire compared to those who didn't watch porn. And you'll find this all over the forums where, and myself is another example, where we have a high drive and we crave novelty, we crave porn on a screen, but we don't necessarily crave and have a high drive to pursue real sex. So it really is about addiction to a stimulus and not just high libido for real sex. Excuse me. Now I want to just go through the negative effects that are most common. We have anorgasmia and delayed ejaculation, which is a precursor to erectile dysfunction, or it can be. It becomes extremely difficult, if not impossible, to climax with your partner. And there have been a couple studies that have found this. This study on hypersexuals found that 71% of the porn addicts reported sexual functioning problems, with 33% reporting delayed ejaculation. And a more recent study, 2021, found more porn use was linked to difficulty achieving orgasm through sexual insecurity, is how they measured it, basically arguing that increased porn use might make you more sexually insecure, and that causes psychological problems. They didn't, however, investigate a direct link for whatever reason, but I suspect that if they did, they would find that porn use is actually the primary cause. A quote from it says, "Although there are many factors that contribute to orgasm difficulty, the present results suggest that pornography, both personal use and pressured use from partners, is one factor for at least some persons." And then we have porn-induced ED, which is what happened to me, where you get to the point where porn's the only thing that can give you an erection. And sometimes in severe cases, I should also say that it gets to the point where you can't even get it up with porn. If desensitization is so deeply present, you can't even get aroused. You can get that desensitized. And I'll cover those brain changes in a little bit. And research has found this. This 2016 study with U.S. Navy psychiatrists and urologists found that erectile dysfunction rates in the last 20 years have skyrocketed. Studies assessing young males under the age of 40, from 18 to 40, found that before 2002, rates were 2 to 5%. And every study assessing young male sexuality after 2010 found rates around 30%. And another more recent study, just published October last year, found that 23% of men under 35 had some level of erectile dysfunction when having sex with a partner. They also found that people who watch more porn also scored higher on porn addiction scales. And I thought this was really interesting. They found that 90% of men fast forward to the most arousing porn scenes. Just to go back to my story, this is definitely something that I did. I would always look for the most arousing parts of the videos I was watching. And I got to the point where I escalated into stuff that wasn't necessarily sex. I'm an open book, but I escalated into compilation videos of ejaculations and all sorts of other stuff, to where I was just getting the biggest shock and surprise. And the level of novelty just continued to escalate as my addiction progressed. And lastly, they found that, I should mention this too. They found that 65% of the men felt that sex with a partner was only 65% of the men found that real sex was more exciting than watching porn. And then 20% felt that they needed to watch more extreme porn to get the same level of arousal as I was just talking about. We have brain fog and concentration problems. I'm going to go through these kind of quick so I can spend more time on the science, but this is basically where you have difficulty concentrating, and you really, it's an attentional bias is the term they use. Once you develop an addiction to porn, Nothing else grabs your attention quite the same. And then this can cause increased social anxiety. When you're in social situations, you feel like all eyes are on you. And this is true for most internet addictions, where you're spending more of your time on a screen rather than interacting with real people. This is a really common side effect. And then I already mentioned declining interest in real relationships. And I should say this happens more subconsciously. Sexual triggers basically lead you to crave pixels on a screen. And you might not consciously even be aware that you would rather have sex with a screen than a real person. You know, I don't know anyone, porn addicts, that would, you know, tell you that, like, oh yeah, I would rather watch porn than have sex. But that's how it eventually ends up playing itself out. And you have escalating into more extreme material, which I mentioned, but this survey of NoFap, which, by the way, on Reddit, NoFap is about to hit 1 million members, just to show you how big of a problem this is. And that's people that actually, you know, signed up for an account. There's a typical forum rule where if you have, you know, out of 10 visitors, one person signs up. So you can, you know, you can be rest assured that the visitors to this forum for porn addiction recovery is in the millions. They found that a majority of those that reported escalating into more extreme material that they considered deviant themselves, 32% didn't have shame. So again, going back to the issues thing driving addiction, these young men and women, because it's not just men, report that they escalated despite having any shame around their porn use. And this happens thanks to sexual conditioning. And some of y'all might have heard about Pavlov's dog. It's the easiest, most popular way to explain it. You have, you know, Pavlov had his dog and he rang a bell every time he gave him food. And eventually the dog's brain wired in that ringing of the bell with the rewarding stimulus of food. And this is what happens when you go down the porn rabbit hole. Anything that you watch while you're in a aroused state can rewire your arousal template in your brain, leading to craving and an activation, if you see a cue for whatever you've got off to in the past, to go back to that stimulus. And this is how you can escalate into stuff that you might not have been innately interested in the first place. You can wire in a new stimulus like the ringing of the bell with your natural desire of eating food. So if we use the example of internet porn, you wire in whatever it is you're watching in an aroused state to your natural drive of sexual arousal and sexual reward. And going back to Norman Doidge, author of The Brain That Changes Itself, he describes how this can happen. He said the content of what patients found exciting changed as websites introduced themes and scripts that altered their brains without their awareness. Because plasticity is competitive, the brain maps for new exciting images increased at the expense of what had previously attracted them. And a study on 16 to 18-year-old heterosexuals looking into the motivations for anal sex looked into this and found that anal heterosex often appeared to be painful, risky, and coercive, particularly for women. And the interviewees, you know, these high school kids, frequently cited pornography as the explanation. And I want to read y'all this important quote because I really think it taps into the idea of sexual conditioning to the point that they might be engaging in a sexual behavior as an adolescent that they weren't innately into. One of the young girls said, obviously people enjoy it if they do it, which, you know, maybe some literacy skills for critically consuming content online is necessary there. But also this young boy's quote is extremely telling and concerning. He said, I think that the boy enjoys it. I think it's the boy that pushes for it from watching porn and stuff. They want to try it. The girl is scared and thinks it's weird, and then they try it because the boyfriend wants them to. They normally don't enjoy it because they're scared, and I know that, like with anal, if you're not willing, you don't relax. So that last sentence right there, they normally don't enjoy it because they're scared, and I know that, like with anal, if you're not willing, you don't relax. So there's a level of manipulation and sometimes coercion that these young people are doing. And it's not just with this behavior. There's a huge rise in choking and other behaviors that there's a level of manipulation and peer pressure because everyone's doing it. And a lot of the reasons, again, I'm not pathologizing and doing a blanket statement if that's, what you're into, but it's unarguable that this is having a drastic impact on young people. It's reshaping the arousal template in their brain, and they have no idea why. They have no idea why they're trying to get their partners to do these things when they're in high school and, early years of college. And the reason I know this is true is because it's true for me. I could have back in the day said exactly what this young boy said because it rings true from my experience in high school and among my peer group of friends. This study is one of the best studies that I think there is on sexual conditioning. I use it all the times when I talk to teenagers and college kids. It showed that you can take a male and a female rat, spray the female with cadaverine, which is the smell of rotting flesh, something that rats are usually innately repulsed by. And if you mate the rats together while the young, virgin male is excited to have sex, if he mates with the female that's sprayed with this cadaverine, he later becomes aroused by that scent. Researchers can give them toys that are laced with the smell, and that conditioned male will play with it and chew on it. Whereas other male rats that weren't conditioned to that scent will behave normally and they will stay away from it, or they will bury the toy in the ground so they don't have to smell it, stuff like that. They'll stay far away. So the point is, what is aversive can become erotic, and sexual conditioning can be very powerful, especially during adolescence, especially during your, early sexual experiences. And the scientific literature for everything I'm describing is getting pretty big. There's over 50 studies now on porn users and sex addicts that support the addiction model. A lot of them actually brain scan studies. And there's over 30 neuroscience-based reviews of the literature. And we have multiple studies where urologists have actually had guys with sexual dysfunction, whether that's erectile dysfunction or inability to climax with the partner. They've actually had them abstain from porn, or what I call rebooting, where you go a period of time without it. And they actually recovered. They regain their ability to function. So it's important to know that those studies exist. And now let's get into the porn debate a little bit. Some of the naysayer talking points, they'll say porn isn't the problem, it's moral incongruence is a real popular phrase that you'll see a lot if you look into the literature on this topic. But I want to talk about a study that looked at what's called perceived addiction, where to break it down for y'all, there's a big argument that porn isn't actually an addiction. It's just shame about using porn, or convincing yourself an addict to the point that you feel bad. So a study called Fernandez et al. 2017 looked into this, and he actually measured people's ability to abstain from porn and compared that to how they feel about if they're addicted or if they struggle with compulsive behavior or not. And he said his findings suggest that regardless of whether an individual morally disapproves of porn, the individual's perceived compulsivity scores may be reflective of actual compulsivity or the experience of difficulty in abstaining from porn. So put simply, Fernandez and his team looked at people that think they're addicted to porn and then watched them try and see if they could abstain, and found that the people that thought they were addicted to porn actually had trouble abstaining. If that makes sense. So the problem is a legit concern, and compulsivity is real. Just like all addictions. One last thing I'll say on that while I'm here is all addictions might have that moral incongruence component where you feel bad about the behavior that you're engaging in, but that in no way negates the fact that it is physiological addiction. So they're not mutually exclusive. And many people do develop an addiction that don't have any moral problem with porn use. The other point that they try and blame the whole porn-induced ED thing on is the refractory period. But it took me 9 months personally to be able to have successful sex without porn or masturbation. So I don't think a refractory period lasts 9 months. And I know of no literature that would suggest that that is a reasonable thing to investigate. And then performance anxiety. This is really important for anyone listening that thinks they might have a porn-induced sexual dysfunction. When I was looking for answers, when I found out I had a problem back when I was 23, I stumbled across this test, and it is see if you can masturbate without porn. Because if you can masturbate with porn, so if your penis still functions with porn, then that might rule out an organic problem, meaning you don't have a cardiovascular issue if you still function okay with porn. But if you can't masturbate without porn, then you might have a cardiovascular problem. If you can't masturbate without porn, then you might be dependent on porn. And that is just a really good test to see if you can function without porn. Because if you're a healthy individual and there's no other problems, you should be able to get aroused without something that didn't even exist 30, 40 years ago. Now, the argument there is porn's always been around, but it's not internet porn. That's the super normal stimulus that can provide as much excitation. People have been able to masturbate without porn since the dawn of time. And so what we have is a serious public health issue. This is a screenshot that I did on a recovery forum, Your Brain Rebalanced, a couple years ago. I just typed in a word like suicide, and I got 26 pages of results. When I was going through recovery, I got into a very dark place myself, went through a depression. I was scared that I might never recover again. And, I found at first I felt alone, and it was extremely helpful. And it gave me so much hope to know that there's so many other people out there struggling with this. But this is screwing up people emotionally, mentally, and physically. But the good news is that we have tons of success stories coming through. My story is one of them. I eventually got my ability to function back and fully recovered. After 9 months, I could have successful sex. After 15 months, I could masturbate without porn. I was no longer dependent on it at all for arousal. And there's thousands and thousands of other success stories that you can find on yourbrainonporn.com if y'all are interested. There's literally I think we have 5,000 stories documented on that site. And this recovery can happen. And it's so beautiful thanks to the brain's reward circuit. Now, I want to transition and focus on some science for a little bit and just go over the basics of the brain's reward circuit and addiction. And I'll probably move through some of these slides fairly quickly. So this is a complicated picture of the reward circuit in the brain. I like to go more simple. And the reward circuit is, it's basically the engine of everything we do. It drives our moods, our emotions, our desires. It's where we fall in love, and it's where we get addicted. And the gas of this engine in our brains is mainly dopamine. It powers the reward circuit. Dopamine is the I got to have it, whatever it is, neurochemical. And research has found that if you block dopamine in rats, for example, they will literally sit there and starve to death if you try and give them food. If you block dopamine and dopamine is low, they have no energy, no motivation, and exhibit signs of depression. And of all natural rewards, things that we naturally find compelling, sexual arousal raises dopamine higher than any other activity. And one of the biggest drivers of dopamine, one of the biggest things that increases dopamine in the brain's reward circuit is novelty. And what is a novelty machine is the internet. And in regards to this presentation, internet porn. And the big game changer happened, like I mentioned earlier, when YouTube was created. And that's when porn sites really changed. They went from having to download stuff to being able to instantly stream multiple videos at the same time and multiple tabs at the same time if you wanted to. And that was when we first saw an explosion of people on the internet with problems all over the forums that I was talking about. And this was around the year 2007, 2008 is when these forums started, right after porn sites changed to tube sites. And the Coolidge effect is the body's automatic response to novel mates. So this Australian study found that if you show a subject the same porn clip multiple times, the arousal, this actually measured their erections and their arousal, it decreased with subsequent showings as they watched the same clip. But on the 19th showing, they switched to a new porn scene and their arousal and their erections skyrocketed. And this guy's quote describes this hunt for novelty, hunt for new potential partners. He said, "I very rarely even watched a whole porn scene, and I can't remember when I saw an entire movie. Too boring. I always wanted new stuff." And musician John Mayer, in his infamous interview with Playboy, he said, "You're always looking for the one out of 100 you swear is going to be the one you finish to, and you still don't finish. You make yourself late for work," which I can relate to. I definitely made myself late to work a couple times back in the day. Now, this novelty of internet porn makes it a supernormal stimulus. Now, a supernormal stimulus is an exaggerated version of something that we naturally find compelling. And researcher Nicholas Tinbergen found that you can dupe all kinds of species of animals and insects into preferring fake over real. He had birds sit on fake eggs that were painted, and they were larger than normal eggs because they thought that was going to produce a better, more strong offspring to carry on their genes into the next generation. And a really interesting thing happened in Australia. The jewel beetle actually, they found that jewel beetles were choosing to mate with beer bottles they saw laying on the ground and ignoring the real female beetles. They thought that the beer bottle was a bigger, healthier beetle, and they chose to pursue fake over real because it was more stimulating. How is this any different than a human choosing to, quote unquote, mate with a screen, a computer, or a phone? This is a screenshot from the movie Don John, where Joseph Gordon-Levitt, he's in a relationship with Scarlett Johansson, yet he still struggles with porn addiction. And this supernormal stimulus, choosing fake over real, is playing out in the world. This Japan survey found that 16 to 19-year-old males from 2008 to 2010, they saw a huge jump in young people that said they have no interest in real sex. And again, that was right after, tube sites were invented, and then the iPhone came out, where tons of young people had easy access to porn on their phones. All of these elevate dopamine, endless sexual novelty, violation of expectations, searching and seeking, anticipation of what's next, shock and surprise, and anxiety. And those are all featured in internet porn. So what are the possible consequences of all this dopamine in response to one type of stimulus? The answer is sexual conditioning and addiction-related brain changes. So to go through addiction really quickly, I'm going to go about 10 more minutes before I take questions. Sensitization, it can be thought of as a super memory of pleasure where you are hyper-activated by cues. We have desensitization, numbed pleasure response and tolerance. Hypofrontality, I'll get into, it's a weakening of the prefrontal cortex. You make poor decisions. and altered stress response. So the first is sensitization. This can be thought of in the old but true saying, nerve cells that fire together, wire together. You see here at the top, you have neurons connected with synaptic connections. And at the bottom, through repeated behavior or experiences, more synaptic connections grow and that link becomes stronger. And a good way to think about this in the brain in regards to porn addiction and sexual conditioning is everything that you experience when you're watching internet porn is wiring in, like Pavlov's dog and the bell, wires into that aroused experience. And this can create sensitization. And then over time, if you think about walking through a field, a pathway is formed, and eventually you can have a super highway, a super memory of pleasure associated with that stimulus. So here you have two competing pathways. You have the porn pathway and you have doing it with real people pathway. Over time, what can happen is porn becomes the preferred pathway. Those neurons, that neuroplasticity happens in regards to seeking and searching content on a screen or your favorite porn site or whatever the case may be. And over time, real people pathway, that innate pathway, that innate drive that you have gets neglected and become weaker to the point that the only thing that can do it for you is porn. Or if you don't have a sexual dysfunction and you're just addicted but can still function, the only thing that grabs your attention and really drives your behavior is compulsively seeking porn. A Cambridge University study found that 60% of the subjects had porn-induced ED and low libido, but they could still function with porn use. The good news is you can recover, you can reboot, and with recovery, you can strengthen those real partner pathways over time as the brain regains sensitivity and neuroplasticity. Nerve cells that fire together wire together, but when nerve cells fire apart, wires depart is the second part of that saying. And this happens thanks to neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to change, where you create new pathways and you weaken old ones. And to go back to the adolescent brain, it's more vulnerable to all of these changes. It's at its peak of dopamine production and every neurochemical production, and it's ready to wire up to experiences in the world. The second brain change is desensitization. That is a numbed pleasure response, and you can envision it like you hear a gunshot or a loud noise at a concert, you're by a speaker. Your ability to hear for a period of time gets impaired. That's the same thing what happens in receptors in the brain when it's bombarded with dopamine. The receiving nerve cell will actually reduce the number of receptors. Now, this hasn't been measured in porn addiction yet, I should say, but it has been found, reduced receptors have been found in internet addiction. And so it'll be interesting to see if more research is done on this area. But what has been found is reduced gray matter, which is nerve cell connections in general. This study out of the Max Planck Institute in 2014 correlated porn use with changes in brain structures and brain responses. It found that higher hours per week and more porn use over years correlated with the reduction in reward circuitry gray matter, which again means those nerve cell connections. The lead author, Simone Kuhn, said that could mean that regular consumption of porn more or less wears out your reward system. And this can manifest in porn addiction as, escalating into new genres to get that bigger neurochemical hit. The third brain change I want to talk about is hypofrontality. And hypo refers to functioning lower than normal, and frontality refers to the frontal lobes, the prefrontal cortex. And you can think of this as the steering wheel. You have the reward circuit, and part of the reward circuit, what drives the car and decides where to go, is the steering wheel. That's the thinking executive control part of the brain. It's a real simple way to think about it. And that same Max Planck study found that nerve connections between the reward circuit and prefrontal cortex worsened with increased porn watching. Excuse me. And then lastly, altered stress response. This is where stress activates that super memory of pleasure and drives you to whatever it is you're addicted to. And it could be withdrawal from addiction. And some common withdrawal effects that we have actually seen in porn addiction are the same for all addictions: stress and anxiety, difficulty sleeping, agitation, lethargy, low motivation, concentration problems. And a study has found this. It found that when abstaining, users were stressed, they became agitated, and they missed it, they craved it. So to sum up, desensitization would say, I can't get no satisfaction. Sensitization would say, hey, I got just what you need, remember? Hypofrontality would say, bad idea, but I can't stop you. And altered stress circuits would say, I need something now. And it chooses to go back to the same thing that created all of the problem in the first place. Now, a few minutes on the diagnostic debate. So big news in 2019, the World Health Organization, ICD-11, the International Classification of Diseases, published in 2019, added compulsive sexual behavior. So what lay people call porn and sex addiction now has an official diagnosis. They found another thing to know about compulsive sexual behavior disorder is recently, I believe 2 months ago, they updated it, the diagnostic criteria to include porn use explicitly, because it wasn't clear that it was in there. No one was debating that porn use wasn't included, but they just wanted to make it explicitly clear. And they also, in the compulsive sexual behavior disorder definition, at the end, it says distress that is entirely related to moral problems is insufficient. So again, the moral incongruence thing doesn't apply to someone with a true addiction or compulsive behavior. Now, here's a slide that I think is really important, and it can get confusing, right? You have impulsions, compulsions, and addictions. And to be honest, addictions do have both components of impulsiveness and compulsiveness. Impulsive is done sudden without thinking. Compulsive is a pathological pursuit of relief, and addiction is a pathological pursuit of reward. That's a good way to differentiate an addiction and a compulsion, right? A compulsion might be compulsively checking the door because you're anxious that you might have left it unlocked, or maybe you're anxious about something, so you're biting your nails and that gives you relief. Whereas an addiction always has that reward component, whether that's to gambling, cocaine, or watching porn. A study found that impulsivity and compulsivity did not contribute as importantly and directly to problematic porn use as compared to hypersexuality. So they found that, classic sex addicts might have more impulsive and compulsive traits than exclusively porn addicts, essentially. And leading experts have said in 2017 in this paper, leading up to the ICD's decision, the World Health decision to include CSBD, a lot of top addiction experts were saying that they believe that compulsive sexual behavior disorder should be included in the addictive category. They said, we believe that classification of compulsive sexual behavior disorder as an addictive disorder is consistent with recent data and might benefit clinicians, researchers, and individuals suffering from and personally affected by this disorder. In 2020, another paper suggested the same. We suggest that porn use disorder is a condition that may be diagnosed with the ICD-11 category, other specified disorders due to addictive behaviors. They said the diagnosis of porn use disorder as other specified disorder due to addictive behaviors may be more adequate for individuals who exclusively suffer from poorly controlled porn viewing. And that code in the ICD, for anyone interested, is 6C5Y. Although that is not a statement from the World Health Organization themselves, Matthias Brand, who has done more studies on porn addiction than anyone, he authored this paper. He was saying that evidence suggests it should be in the addiction category. So gambling and gaming are now officially recognized as an addiction. So why not porn? My personal opinion is it's politics, but researchers being true to themselves say that there just needs to be more research done. But this paper argued that the same logic that sees gambling and gaming in the addiction category should apply to porn use. And if you think about it, I always say, if you think playing with cards or rolling dice can be an addiction, how not can watching porn until 3 or 4 a.m. while you ruin your life, how can that not be an addiction? But the debate rages on. And just last week, this paper came out, and they concluded that overall, the inclusion of CSPD in the ICD-11 has been a positive impact, and it hasn't led to over pathologizing of normal behaviors. So with that, I will conclude and get to some questions. Okay. To answer Jeremy's question, he said, you seem to be equating interest in anal sex with tolerance, withdrawal, and violence. Odd to me. I'm not trying to equate the two. I'm just pointing out what young people are reporting and what was true for myself. I'm not saying you escalate into that. Although that is true for many people. You can obviously do that safely and consensually, and that's not everyone's, it's not everyone's journey escalating into that. Some people might want to innately do that. So again, I'm not trying to do a blanket statement on anyone's preferences or pathologize healthy behavior. After 9 months without porn, do you recommend looking at porn again, or would you say no to not looking at it for life? Or would you recommend not looking at it for life? I personally, there's the old saying, once an addict, always an addict, which I don't necessarily personally agree with, although I know why people say that, because those addiction pathways might never completely fully go away in your brain. They might become dormant, kind of like a concrete path that grows grass over it. That concrete path is still there, and you can brush it off pretty easily and reopen the floodgates, if you will. So my advice and suggestion is to stay away from it permanently, but I have heard of some people going back to occasional use without it getting out of control. That's just a really, really rare story, and not my advice for anyone that has been considered an addict or feels that they've struggled with compulsive or addictive use. The slide about recovery advice. Yeah, sure. I'll go ahead and give my answer. Another anonymous comment. What was the slide about recovery advice? My advice for recovery is, number one, get educated. I encourage everyone to go to yourbrainonporn.com or get the book by the same name, Your Brain on Porn. Lots of scientific information in there to really understand what's going on in the brain. Number two is get support, whether that's seeking professional help through a place like the Center for Healthy Sex or a psychologist or therapist. And then you could also join a recovery forum like mine, Reboot Nation, but there's others. There's NoFap and Porn Free, and a website called Your Brain Rebalanced. All great places to get support. And then lastly, I would say on advice for recovery is the biggest thing I see is people focus all of their attention on not watching porn, not watching porn, not watching porn. But that's like trying not to think of the purple elephant. You think of the purple elephant. My number one piece of advice is to focus on goals and building the life that you want. One of my favorite quotes for recovery is, the secret of change is to focus all of your energy, not on fighting the old, but on building the new, by Dan Millman, I believe. That's a really good quote. So that's my advice for recovery. What was the biggest intervention that helped you in your recovery? First, it was finding the scientific information and really connecting the dots of everything I experienced back in the day that I had just been blind to. Sometimes I would finish watching porn and go, what in the world did I just watch? Like, why did I watch that? And then also thinking back to some things that I tried to get my partners to do. that at the time I just thought was the cool thing to do because everyone was doing it. But looking back, learning that neuroscience perspective of how I was rewiring my brain, honestly, it was the biggest epiphany in my life and just complete light bulb moment that really was the 180 turn, the biggest intervention. And then other than that, I would say I'm an open person, which has led to me, doing stuff like this. But I immediately, once I got educated and saw that I was recovering, I started talking to people. And so opening up to others really helped. And I highly encourage someone to find someone to talk to, whether that's professional or in-person support group or an online forum. Thank you, Bernard. Let's see, I'm going through, hold on, bear with me. This is an interesting question. Brian asked, so this would explain why people who do not identify as being attracted to minors end up getting into child pornography or child sexual abuse material. I need to be very careful answering this, but I'll just say that it is certainly a possibility that if you're someone that's not innately attracted to minors can escalate into child sexual abuse material. It is absolutely possible. I'm out of my league trying to diagnose and discuss this question, but based on what I've seen and the evidence, the research that I've learned from scientists is that it's absolutely a possibility that needs further investigation. And my personal opinion is it does happen. Jill Smith, have I heard about the easy peasy way to help with porn addiction? Yes, I have. I believe that this is like the book based on quitting smoking. And yeah, it's just, from what I understand, it's really good practical advice, and people could check it out. I'm not real familiar with it myself, though. Dana asked, as an addictions counselor, how would you suggest supporting someone with a porn addiction, often alongside other addictions as well? Well, I think there's two components to working with an addict. I think first, you gotta figure out why they are addicted, and then I like to say why you can't quit. So there's going to be a lot of assessment that needs to go on in their overall life and their childhood. I think that the number one thing you need to do is look at overall behaviors and routines in their life, and you can apply that to whatever they are addicted to. If they do have multiple addictions, my opinion is you want to get your client pursuing as many healthy behaviors as possible, and avoiding as many bad behaviors as possible. And you would support someone with a porn addiction the same way you would support someone with any addiction, with the exception that since porn is so accessible, drastic times might call for drastic measures, at least for a period of time. So maybe there needs to be a window where they really limit or cut off use to a smartphone or internet accessible device until that prefrontal cortex can get a little strength back and those sensitized pathways can weaken and they can regain sensitivity of that desensitization, to give yourself a little jump start. I hope that helps. I'll take a few more questions. Michael Smith asks, are you familiar with any studies using an, I believe that's internal family system type model or internal parts work with porn addiction treatment? I'm not familiar with any studies looking at IFS. I have heard Mark Lewis talk about IFS a lot in some of his presentations, but I'm not aware of IFS being looked at for porn addiction yet. I could be mistaken, though. I definitely think it's a good thing to try and look into. And it's a model that I think from the psychological component, especially if you combine that with the learning and neuroscience component, I think that can be a really powerful combination for recovery. Anonymous asks, would you recommend Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous meetings to people struggling with porn addiction? Yes, I would. I would try and seek out a porn addiction specific group if you struggle exclusively with porn use. But I think a lot of good comes from just being in person with other people struggling with a sexual addiction. But just keep in mind, if you're someone seeking that out, or if you know someone who you're encouraging to go to a support group, that, like I said early on, they may not relate to their stories as much as someone with an exclusive porn addiction. But that's okay. You know, people being open and vulnerable is a beautiful thing and super healing. So yes, I support, I encourage anyone to get to a in-person group. I'll take one more question. Let's go with this one from Carla. You ask, for your recovery, did you also eliminate social media? Excuse me. Did I also eliminate social media platforms to include Facebook, Instagram, etc., which promote sexualized platforms? Yeah, there's definitely sexualized content on all social media. And I did briefly, early on in my recovery, I cut out all social media for the most part. And I also, I wasn't even watching movies. I remember in my recovery, I think it was The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, I believe. There's a scene in there that was super, in the middle of my recovery. It basically gave me a panic attack. And from that moment on, I decided, you know what, I'm not going to watch movies where I know there's a sex scene for at least until I feel recovered and in a healthier place. And I always tell porn addicts, especially, you want to look at recovery as not just porn, not a produced video or something like that, but really porn addiction is anything artificial stimulation you're using to become aroused. So if you're surfing dating websites or scrolling through TikTok or Instagram or Twitter, you're still reinforcing the neurological pathways of novel arousing content. So you might be switching from liquor to light beer, so to say, but you're still reinforcing that addiction. And as far as sexual dysfunction recovery goes, many guys found out that they couldn't fully recover their sexual function until they eliminated, social media, because they were using that as a replacement for actually watching porn. And with that, I'm sorry if I didn't get to your question. There's a lot of other ones, but we are out of time. I really appreciate everyone that has listened to me ramble, and I apologize for my dry throat. Haven't been feeling super good, but I hope that it was helpful and easy to digest. And I hope the best for y'all. Much love and thanks for being here. And thanks to Center for Healthy Sex for having me.